wonderful friends. It is great to see you. Thank you for being here. Before we start, I want to tell you about a few things coming up. First of all, on Monday, if you live in the Scottsdale area, we will be having an in-person speaker, Dr. Steve Felton, who is a Holocaust survivor, telling his story. If you live in the Denver area, next Wednesday, we'll be having an in-person talk with Rabbi Dov Linzer and Abby Pogribin. He's an Orthodox rabbi. She's a Reformed journalist in dialogue about their Torah commentary book they put out. It's also very exciting. And virtually, both of those are virtual as well. And virtually, exclusively, next Thursday, Rabbanit Bracha Jaffe in New York City is giving a talk, Are You My Mother? Nature and Nurture in Moshe's Life. We think that'll be very nice too. For those of y'all in Colorado, I want to share an exciting update also that in addition to our senior Jewish educator there, and in addition to our fellowship director, we now also just hired a full-time engagement director, Ariel Nassau, originally from Mexico City, and you will be seeing him around Denver. It's very exciting, and you'll get the chance to meet him if you come next Wednesday. So thank you all for your continued participation, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's session with Dr. Elias Sacks, who is not a first-time educator here at VBM. We've had him a number of times before, and it's a testament both to his engaging style and the depth of his content that he's one of our most common returnees. And he's also a partner of ours, being that he's based out of Denver. And it also so happens that his wife is one of the rabbis and cantors at our partner Temple Emmanuel in Denver. So the topic today is God dead, as we will explore through philosophical and theological lenses, but I'll save the intro to that for him. Elias Sacks is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he studies Jewish thought, philosophy of religion, Jewish-Christian relations, religious ethics, and religion and politics. He's the author of Moses Mendelssohn's Living Script, Philosophy, Practice, History, Judaism in 2017, as well as articles on medieval and modern thinkers, including Mendelssohn, Moses Maimonides, Baruch Spinoza, Nachman Krachmal, Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, and Jacob Taus. Previously, Sacks served as director of the Jewish Publication Society. He is a leader on many of those thinkers, including Mendelssohn, who he's taught about before here at Valley Beit Midrash. But in particular, he's a world expert on Nachman Krachmal, so we will have to have him back one day to share some of his teachings with us. But today, the topic is God dead. With that, Dr. Sacks, thank you for being here, and we pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for that kind introduction. Thank you to the Valley Beit Midrash, of course, for hosting me. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm looking forward to learning and to thinking together. And I'll just add that if anyone here is joining us from California, or if anyone here has friends or loved ones in the Los Angeles area, our thoughts are with you. So today's topic is a question. Is God dead? And that language, right, that language about the death of God has a long history that goes back to at least the 1600s. And it's been used to mean a variety of different things. Ever since at least the late 1800s, or ever since the late 19th century, this language has been used to challenge belief in God, to argue that God is dead in the sense that belief in God is dead, that it simply does not make sense to believe in something we might call God. I'm going to share my screen for a moment here. So, as some of you may know, the kind of best known use of that God is dead language to convey this idea that belief in God doesn't make sense, the kind of best known usage of that God is dead language comes from the work of a 19th century German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who in a book entitled The Gay Science tells a parable of a madman who shows up in a marketplace and cries, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him," right? This madman kind of proclaims that belief in God no longer makes sense. And in fact, that it's we, human beings, who have accomplished this, right? That we have undermined belief in God. However, this phrase also has had a long kind of post-Nietzschean afterlife, including as the basis of this controversial April 1966 cover story for the news magazine Time. This story, in fact, was so influential and controversial that it made it into the 1968 horror film Rosemary's Baby, where the kind of title character Rosemary finds a copy in her doctor's waiting room. We may come back to the history of this phrase, God is dead, later, maybe in the Q&A. For most of our time, though, our focus is going to be less on the phrase God is dead in particular, and more on the underlying claim, on the idea that there is something profoundly problematic about belief in something we might call God, right? And even as critiques of belief in God have become increasingly prevalent, many thinkers have challenged those challenges. Many thinkers have argued kind of not only that there are good reasons to believe in God, but also that this belief is in some sense more important now than ever. And so in our time together today, I thought that we could look at some Jewish interventions in this ongoing conversation. I thought we could look at some Jewish attempts to wrestle with the question, is God dead? At some Jewish responses to the question, does it make sense to believe in God? In particular, I thought that we could proceed in 3 stages. So I thought we could begin with 3 types of challenges to belief in God. Right? 2 of these challenges, I'll add, come from thinkers who themselves come from Jewish backgrounds. Then I thought we could look at 3 Jewish responses to these challenges, 3 attempts by Jewish thinkers to argue for the coherence of some sort of belief in a deity. And then I thought we could conclude by asking us kind of where this leaves today. Does this seem kind of reasonable to everyone as an agenda? Kind of challenges to belief in God, including from Jewish figures, responses to those challenges, kind of also from Jewish figures, and finally, reflections on where this leaves us. Okay, excellent. Before I dive into those challenges, though, I want to say something about the term God, this term we've been mentioning so far. So even if we were just to restrict our focus to Judaism, there are many ways to understand this concept. Some Jewish sources describe God as a personal being, as an entity that possesses characteristics associated with persons, right, such as emotions, and that cares about humans and acts in history. Others understand God as an impersonal cause of the cosmos that feels nothing, is unconcerned with humans, and spends eternity in contemplation. Still others, maybe some medieval Jewish mystics, understand God as possessing multiple parts, both an unknowable core and emanations that emerge from that core and have characteristics such as gender. Of course, there are other possibilities as well. Now, some of you may have noticed in my earlier comments, I said nothing about any of these understandings. Instead, I simply said that we've been focusing on debates about whether it makes sense to believe in something we might call God, kind of without defining what that something is. On some level, this is just me trying to avoid a difficult question. This is me kind of sidestepping this thorny issue of definition. But more fundamentally, though, this is an attempt to be faithful to the sources we're about to explore. Different critics and different defenders of belief in God have very different conceptions of the kind of entity that they're criticizing or defending. Very different conceptions of what it means to believe in something called God. And so rather than kind of prejudge or predetermine what God means, I thought that we could treat this as one of the questions that is itself contested and explored and imagined and reimagined as part of the conversation with which we'll be wrestling. When we ask that question, is God dead? Part of what we're going to be asking is which vision of God, if any, is dead, and which vision, if any, of God remains alive. Okay, so with that in mind, we'll begin by looking at 3 sorts of challenges to belief in God. First, the claim that belief in an all-caring, powerful God is psychologically problematic. Second, the claim that belief in an all-powerful, caring God is historically problematic. And third, the claim that belief in one God, in monotheism itself, is ethically problematic. Okay, so the figure that we'll use to explore the first challenge is one of modernity's most influential thinkers, Sigmund Freud. often regarded as the founder of psychoanalysis. He's born in 1856, lives most of his life in Austria until he flees the Nazis in 1938, 1 year before his death. And as some of you may know, he came from a Jewish background. In fact, one of his final books is called Moses and Monotheism, and it argues that Moses was a monotheistic Egyptian priest murdered by his ancient followers. A murder, Freud says, that then led the descendants of those followers, namely the Jews, to experience a sense of collective guilt with which they've been wrestling ever since. If you've never read this book, I highly recommend it. It is absolutely brilliant and absolutely bonkers. For our purposes, though, the text that I want to look at today is going to be a 1927 work by Freud called Future of an Illusion. And that final word, illusion, is crucial to his argument. This is how he defines that term. An illusion, he says, is not the same thing as an error. What's characteristic of illusions is that they're derived from human wishes. Illusions need not necessarily be false, that is to say, unrealizable or in contradiction to reality. For instance, a middle-class girl may have the illusion that a prince will come and marry her. This is possible, and a few such cases have occurred. We call a belief an illusion when a wish fulfillment is a prominent factor. Right, so according to Freud, in the passage you see on your screen, what makes something an illusion is not that it is false and not that it's an error. Rather, what makes something an illusion is that it's derived from human wishes. Right? An illusion is something we believe simply because we want it to be true. Something that we believe not because we have evidence in favor of it, but simply because it's a sort of thing that we really want to be the case, right? So Freud's example is this middle-class girl's belief that a prince will come and marry her. What's problematic about this belief for Freud is not that it's necessarily false, right? On the contrary, as Freud admits, this sort of thing could happen. Rather, what's problematic about this belief is that it's almost certainly just the result of this person wanting it to be true. Right? It seems unlikely that this middle-class child has listed all living princes, studied their travel patterns and romantic preferences, and come to the conclusion that one or more of these princes is likely to cross her path and be romantically compatible. Rather, what's presumably happened is that this middle-class girl really wants to marry a prince, right? She wants to escape her middle-class life. She wants to enjoy everything that comes with royalty. And so she convinces herself that this will happen, right? This, for Freud, is what makes something an illusion. It's a belief we hold because we want it to be true, right? Think of someone who believes that they'll win the lottery, right? From Freud's perspective, the problem with this belief isn't that it necessarily is false, right? People do win the lottery. The problem with this belief is that it's almost certainly grounded in wish fulfillment, right? This individual wants to win the lottery, and so they convince themselves that they'll do so. And this, according to Freud, is what's wrong with belief in God. Religious ideas, he says, are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. The secret of their strength lies in the strength of these wishes. The benevolent rule of a divine being allays our fears of the dangers of life. The establishment of a moral world order ensures the fulfillment of the demands of justice. And so think about what it means to believe in God, Freud says, and more specifically in a God who is benevolent and can establish a moral world order and ensure the fulfillment of the demands of justice, right? A God who cares about our well-being and who can accomplish anything, including ensuring that good triumphs over evil. Right? According to Freud, this belief is an illusion. It's something we believe because we want it to be true. Right? When we believe in God, it's not typically because we've made a careful survey of all the natural phenomena in the world around us and all the events that have ever occurred in history, and then come to the conclusion that the most reasonable explanation for these phenomena and those events is that they're the work of a benevolent, all-powerful God. Rather, we believe in God because we want there to be a God, because it's comforting to believe in a God, right? We want an entity who will protect us from the dangers of life. We want there to be a being who makes sure that good triumphs over evil. And to be sure, Freud admits, none of this disproves the existence of God. Nevertheless, once we recognize religious beliefs as illusions, consequences follow. To assess the truth value of religious doctrines, Freud says, does not lie within the scope of the present inquiry. It's enough for us that we've recognized them as being, in their psychological nature, illusions. But we don't have to conceal the fact that this discovery also strongly influences our attitude. It would be very nice if there were a God who created the world and was a benevolent being, and if there were a moral world order in the universe and an afterlife. But it's a very striking fact that all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. And it would be more remarkable still if our wretched, ignorant, and downtrodden ancestors had succeeded in solving all these difficult riddles of the universe. Look, Freud says, we can't disprove the existence of God, but come on. In any other scenario, if someone holds a belief that just happens to coincide with their wishes and desires, we'd be pretty skeptical. When someone tells us that they're marry a prince or that they're going to win the lottery, we're rightly suspicious. We suspect that these beliefs are little more than expressions of those individuals' desires. We'll be wary of adopting such beliefs ourselves. And we may even try to dissuade that individual from placing too much stock in those beliefs, say from dropping out of school in order to prepare for a royal wedding, or from maxing out credit cards in the anticipation of a lottery-induced financial windfall. And if that would be our response to those other illusions, Freud says, then that should also be our response to religious illusions, right? It would be very nice if there were a God, he says, but it's a striking fact that all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. Just as we're suspicious of illusions about princes and lotteries, we should be suspicious of illusions about God. We should recognize that belief in God is grounded in desires rather than in a reasonable assessment of empirical reality. And we should therefore be wary of adopting that belief ourselves. So this then is one kind of challenge to belief in God. The claim that belief in an all-powerful, caring God is psychologically problematic. For Freud, belief in God is like the illusion of a child. It's something that's affirmed because we want it to be true, not because we have evidence for it being true. And just as we need to outgrow our childish illusions, so too do we need to outgrow our religious illusions. Okay, so that's one type of challenge to belief in God, but it's not the only one. And to see another example, let's look at the work of a 20th century American rabbi and theologian, Richard Rubinstein. So he was born in 1924, and after receiving rabbinical ordination and a doctoral degree, he kind of first worked as a congregational rabbi in Hillel Professional. By the 1970s, though, he shifts to an academic career, and he would teach for many years at Florida State University and towards the end of his life at the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut. He passed away in 2021. And for our purposes, Rubinstein's most important contribution appears in an essay he published in 1966, focused on what it means to believe in God after the Holocaust. This is what he says, as you see on your screen. We stand in a cold, silent, unfeeling cosmos, unaided by any purposeful power beyond our own resources. After Auschwitz, what else can a Jew say about God? How can Jews believe in an omnipotent, beneficent God after Auschwitz? Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in the historical drama. It's interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. I fail to see, though, how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. The agony of European Jewry cannot even be likened to the testing of human beings in some biblical narratives. To see any purpose in the death camps, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion in all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. The idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. So how, Rubinstein asks, can Jews believe in an omnipotent, beneficent God after Auschwitz? If God cares about human beings and is all-powerful, then what happens in history somehow has to reflect that care and power. What happens in history has to have some purpose consistent with God's concern for us. And it has to, in some sense, be guided by God's power. It has to, in some sense, be what God wants to happen. How, though, could we affirm that of the Holocaust? What possible purpose could the Holocaust have? How could Nazi genocide possibly be what God wants to happen? Right? It can't be a punishment for some Jewish sin, because that would force us to regard Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. We'd have to say not only that Jews committed some sin so egregious that near genocide was the appropriate punishment, but also that Hitler was God's chosen emissary for this holy, righteous, divine punishment. The Holocaust can't even be a biblical style kind of test, an attempt to inflict suffering on Jews to see whether they'd respond by maintaining their faith. That too would force us to regard something demonic as an expression of God's purposes. That too would force us to say that God wanted the Holocaust to occur, that God saw the Holocaust as an appropriate way to test Jews' faith, and that Hitler again was a means to that divine end, a vessel of a divine purpose. And that idea, Rubinstein concludes, is simply too obscene for me to accept. It's offensive, obscene, to regard the Holocaust as an expression of some divine purpose, some divine plan. And so the only reasonable response then is to reject belief in an omnipotent, beneficent God and conclude that we stand in a cold, silent, unfeeling cosmos. Whatever higher something is out there, it is not an all-powerful, caring deity. And to be sure, this doesn't mean that Judaism is somehow irrelevant. Right? Rubinstein writes, though I believe that a void stands where we once experienced God's presence, I don't think Judaism has lost its meaning or power. Judaism is the way we share the decisive times and crises of life through the traditions of our inherited community. The need for that sharing is not diminished in the time of the death of God. We no longer believe in the God who has the power to annul the tragic necessities of existence. The need religiously to share that existence remains. Right? Even if we live in a cold, silent, unfeeling cosmos, we're still going to experience tragedies and crises, illnesses, heartbreak, war, famine. We're still going to need then some way to share those tragic necessities with others. We're going to need to gather with others to acknowledge those tragedies, seek comfort during those tragedies, find ways to go on living during those tragedies. And that's what something like Judaism offers. It offers us a community where we can gather with others to live and find comfort and persevere. Nevertheless, we need to recognize that a void stands where we once experienced God's presence, that the world is full of tragedy, and there is nothing at all out there beyond us to aid, support, or comfort us. We can live Jewishly, but we do so in a void. Now, so there's more to say about Rubinstein, including the role that he does ascribe to God language, especially God language drawn from Jewish mysticism. For us, though, the key point is that Rubinstein represents a second kind of challenge to belief in God, a claim that belief in an all-powerful, caring God is historically problematic. Right? In a world full of evils such as the Holocaust, it's simply unacceptable to claim that there's a God out there who cares enough about us to get involved in history and who is capable of doing so. Right? To do that, we'd have to say that the Holocaust was an expression of divine care and power, and that's obscene. Okay, so we've seen two sorts of critiques of belief in God. Before we turn to responses, though, I want to consider one more critique. And it's one that we can grasp if we look at the work of Regina Schwartz, who's a scholar of English literature and religion at Northwestern University. She's written on a broad range of topics, but for our purposes, her most relevant text is a 1997 book entitled The Curse of Cain: The Violent Legacy of Monotheism. It's a wide-ranging text, but one of its central claims is the one that you see on your screen now. We are the heirs, Schwartz writes, of a long tradition in which monotheism is regarded as the great achievement of Judeo-Christian thought, holding out the promise of universalism and with it an endorsement of ethics and peace. But upon closer inspection, sometimes monotheism is entangled with particularism, with the assertion that this God and not any other gods must be worshipped. A particularism that can become so virulent that it reduces all other gods to idols, and so violent that it reduces all other worshippers to abominations. The danger of a universal monotheism is asserting that its truth is the truth, its system of knowledge the system of knowledge, its ethics the ethics. Many of us, Schwartz notes, find ourselves in settings that celebrate monotheism, by which she means the idea that there's only one divine being who merits our allegiance, that this God and not any other gods must be worshipped. She does note elsewhere in her book that the technical term for this attitude is actually monolatry rather than monotheism, but that's a separate point. And this posture, she notes, is often understood as holding out the promise of a universalism, and with it the endorsement of ethics and peace, right? If there's one God, the argument goes, then all of us are connected to one another through that God, maybe by being creations of that God. And we therefore have ethical obligations to one another, including presumably the obligation to try to strive to live peacefully with one another. The problem, however, is that upon closer inspection, sometimes monotheism is entangled with a particularism so virulent that it reduces all other gods to idols, and so violent that it reduces all other worshippers to abominations. Once we conclude that only one God should be worshipped, it's natural to go a step further and conclude that there really is just one God, that other beings worshipped by other groups aren't divine at all, but instead are mere idols, false deities who don't actually exist. Moreover, once we conclude that other groups are worshiping those false deities, it's easy to conclude that those other groups are doing something deeply problematic, right? Those groups are guilty of an abomination, of treating false idols of their own creation with the respect and the reverence that only the true God deserves. And once we do that, Schwartz worries, the consequences can be harsh. Just look, she says, at the Hebrew Bible. A transcendent deity breaks into history with the demand that the people he constitutes obey the laws he institutes. And first and foremost among those laws is the requirement that they pledge allegiance to him alone. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. A people are forged by the worship of one deity, Yahweh, and what makes others other, Egyptian, Moabite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hittite, or Hurrian, is their worship of foreign gods. This people is to be the exclusive possession of the deity and none other. And they are to have the exclusive desire for this deity and none other. The other against whom the Israelites' identity is forged is abhorred, abject, impure, and vast numbers of them are obliterated. So Schwartz begins with the Ten Commandments and God's demand that the biblical Israelites shall have no other gods. Once the biblical Israelites come to distinguish themselves by commitment to one specific God, Schwartz reasons, they're also going to distinguish themselves from other groups that worship foreign gods. And the result is that those other groups are going to be abhorred, abject, impure, and vast numbers of them are obliterated. Right? Those other groups are going to be seen as guilty of a profound religious sin, of failing to recognize the correct God, and thus are going to be seen as worthy of disgust at best and elimination at worst, right? Schwartz has in mind passages such as this one from the 7th chapter of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. When the Lord your God brings you to the land that you are about to enter and possess, and he dislodges many nations before you, you must doom them to destruction. Grant them no terms and give them no quarter. You shall not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. For you are a people consecrated to the Lord your God. He will deliver the kings of the Hittites, Girgashites, and other nations you dislodge into your hand, and you shall obliterate their name from under the heavens. No man shall stand up to you until you have wiped them out. You shall consign the images of their gods to the fire. Look, part of what the Hebrew Bible reveals, Schwartz says, is that the path from monotheism to intolerance and ultimately to violence is all too short, right? Once we think that we have to worship only one God, it's natural for us to conclude that there is only one God, and that anyone who worships a different God is guilty of a grave religious error at best and profound religious sin at worst. And once we've made that leap, she worries, it's easy to see these others as abhorred, abject, impure, and worthy of obliteration. It's easy to view those others with intolerance, to see their distinctive beliefs and practices not as differences to be celebrated, but as errors to be disparaged, maybe even eliminated. Again, there's more to say here. But the important point for us is that what we have in Schwartz is a third kind of challenge to belief in God. It's a kind of challenge that claims that, and if one kind of challenge, right, claims that belief in God is claims that belief in an all-powerful, caring God is psychologically problematic, and if a second kind of challenge claims that belief in an all-powerful, caring God is historically problematic, then this third kind of challenge claims that belief in one God in monotheism itself is ethically problematic, right? Once we think that there's only one God worthy of worship, it's easy to think that only one God exists. And once we think that only one God exists, it's easy to think that anyone who disagrees is guilty of a profound religious error, needs to be corrected or eliminated. It's easy, that is, to adopt a attitude of intolerance verging on or becoming violence. Right? Schwartz is advancing here a claim that's quite radical. Right? Whereas Freud and Rubinstein are troubled by belief in a certain sort of God, Schwartz is troubled by the mere fact of belief in one God, in one deity to the exclusion of others. Okay, so what are some possible responses? How have Jewish thinkers responded to these claims? In our remaining time, I want to consider one response to each of these three critiques. And I'm not suggesting that these responses are necessarily directed at the specific texts we've just encountered. In fact, in one case, the kind of response to the ethical critique of monotheism, the response that we're going to look at was actually published almost a decade prior to Schwartz's work in response to similar sorts of claims by others. Rather, what I want to do is look at three arguments that address the kinds of issues that came up in the texts we just encountered, even if the specific targets are slightly different. Okay, so let's begin with the psychological critique of belief in God. So one response to this type of argument appears in one of the 20th century's best-known Jewish thinkers, Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was born in 1907 in Poland, and he came to the United States in 1940, where he would go on to become an influential theologian and activist, teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary and becoming involved in the civil rights movement. Some of you know the kind of famous pictures you see here of him with Martin Luther King Jr. And the Heschel text we'll be considering comes from a book he published in 1955 called God in Search of Man. Heschel begins as follows. It's long been known that need and desire play a part in the shaping of beliefs. But is it true, as modern psychology often claims, that our religious beliefs are nothing but attempts to satisfy subconscious wishes? Of course, said Heschel. Figures like Freud are correct when they say that need and desire play a part in shaping beliefs. Of course, there are cases where we believe things because we want to believe them. But does it necessarily follow, Heschel asks, that our religious beliefs are nothing but attempts to satisfy subconscious wishes? Even if we sometimes hold certain beliefs because we want those beliefs to be true, is that all there is to religious beliefs? Is belief in God nothing but a reflection of our desires? So Heschel's answer proceeds as follows. It's a long passage, but we'll figure it out. Faced with the mind-surpassing grandeur of the universe, we cannot but admit that there is meaning which is greater than man. Confined in our own study rooms, we may entertain any idea that comes to mind. Under such circumstances, it's even plausible to say that the world is worthless and all meaning a dream or fiction. And yet no one can sneer at the stars, mock the dawn, ridicule the outburst of the spring, or scoff at the totality of being. Standing between heaven and earth, we're silenced. Awe is the awareness of transcendent meaning, of a spiritual suggestiveness of reality, an elusiveness to transcendent meaning. The world in its grandeur is full of a spiritual radiance for which we have neither name nor concept. We're struck with an awareness of the immense preciousness of being. To our sense of mystery and wonder, the world is too incredible, too meaningful for us, and its existence the most unlikely, the most unbelievable fact, contrary to all reasonable expectations. Even our ability to wonder fills us with amazement. This, then, is the insight we gain in acts of wonder, not to measure meaning in terms of our own mind, but to sense a meaning infinitely greater than ourselves. Imagine what it's like, Heschel says, to step outside and look at the stars, the dawn, the beginning of spring. I live in Colorado, so the example I often give when I share this with students is the mountains. When you're out there, Heschel says, if you're really honest, it's hard not to experience a sense of awe, understood as awareness of transcendent meaning, an awareness of the immense preciousness of being. We'll feel in those moments that there's more than we can fully make sense of or fully understand, that we can't measure meaning in terms of our own mind, and that we're instead sensing a meaning infinitely greater than us, right? As we find ourselves in these moments where we're sort of overwhelmed by the wonder of creation, Um, we have the sense that however much we can grasp scientifically, there's nevertheless still so much more that eludes us. There's still a kind of grandeur and radiance to the world for which we have neither name nor concept. And this, Heschel says, should reorient our views on God. The sense of wonder on mystery does not give us knowledge of God. It only leads to a plane where the question about God becomes an inescapable concern. Explicit denial of the realness of the ultimate God object is absurd. Let man proclaim his denial of God's existence over a loudspeaker that would bring his voice to the Milky Way 100 million light years from now, and how ludicrous he would be. There can be no honest denial of the existence of God. There can only be faith or the honest confession of inability to believe, or arrogance. So let's be clear, Heschel says, this sense of wonder, awe, and mystery does not give us a knowledge of God, right? Nothing about being overwhelmed by mountains or stars or dawn proves the existence of some sort of deity, right? What overwhelms me with wonder today could become explicable in some more straightforwardly scientific way tomorrow. Even if there is some transcendent dimension out there, that could turn out to be something other than a deity. But what the sense of wonder on mystery does do is lead to a plane where the question about God becomes an inescapable concern. It forces us to contemplate the possibility that there might be a God. Right? If we cannot but admit that there's a meaning which is greater than human beings, that there is some transcendent dimension of reality that eludes our grasp, we can't help but admit that the source of that meaning, that transcendent dimension, might be a deity, some sort of powerful being who cares deeply about us and has created a world full of mystery, radiance, and wonder. In other words, Heschel says, there can be no honest denial of the existence of God. It's impossible to be intellectually honest, he says, and rule out the possibility that God exists. We can respond to our sense of wonder and awe with faith, with the belief that all of this is rooted in God. We can respond to our sense of wonder and awe with an honest confession of inability to believe, with a recognition that there might be a God, but we can't really bring ourselves to make that leap. But an actual denial that God exists would be absurd or ludicrous at best, and arrogant at worst, Heschel says. At best, this denial would be incoherent. We'd be saying that there's something out there which eludes our grasp, but which nevertheless we understand well enough to confidently characterize as not being a deity. We'd be saying that there is so much more out there than we can possibly understand, but that we nevertheless know that that realm doesn't include a God. And at worst, this would actually be quite arrogant. We'd be projecting our own limited cognitive capacities onto the cosmos as a whole. We'd be saying that we can measure meaning in terms of our own mind. That if we can't bring ourselves to believe in God, there isn't a God. What Heschel is doing, in other words, is turning the tables on the kind of critique we saw in Freud. Right? For Freud, belief in God is the result of our own desires. And this means that belief in God is psychologically problematic. For Heschel, by contrast, contests both of these claims. While he agrees that some beliefs might emerge from our desires, he rejects the idea that belief in God is necessarily such a belief. It might result not from wishes, but from wonder. Not from wanting there to be a God, but from recognizing that there is so much more out there than we can possibly grasp. And while he agrees that some beliefs are psychologically problematic, he insists that it's atheism rather than theism, which falls into that category. What's psychologically problematic, he says, is saying that we know that there isn't a God. We can believe in God. We can say that we can't bring ourselves to believe in God, but anything else is absurd or arrogant. So this then is the kind of response to the first sort of challenge we encountered. But Jews have also responded to the second kind of challenge we encountered, to that claim that belief in an all-powerful, caring God is historically problematic, that in a world full of evil such as the Holocaust, it's simply unacceptable to claim that there's a God out there who cares enough about us to get involved in history. And here the key figure is another American rabbi, Yitz Greenberg. He was born in 1933 and is still active today. He actually just published a new book this past summer. He's a modern Orthodox rabbi who's written on a wide variety of topics. I believe he's taught and learned with VBM before. And the text that will concern us today is an essay that he published in 1976 called Cloud of Smoke, Pillar of Fire. It's a sprawling piece that addresses a number of issues. But one dimension is a response to the sort of claim we just encountered. This is what Greenberg says. Faith is living in the presence of the Redeemer, even when the world is unredeemed. After Auschwitz, faith means that there are times when faith is overcome. We now have to speak of moment faiths, moment when Redeemer and vision of redemption are present, interspersed with times when the flames and smoke of the burning children who died in the Holocaust blot out faith, though it flickers again. Of course, the question may still be asked, why is the result of the Holocaust not the permanent destruction of faith? One reason is that there are moments when a member of the community of Israel shares the reality of the child who was to have been bricked into the wall, but instead experienced the liberation and dignity of Exodus. The reference here is to the rabbinic legend that in Egypt, Jewish children were bricked into a wall if their parents did not meet their daily quota of bricklaying. This happens even to those who have both literally and figuratively lived through the Holocaust. But if those powerful moments occur, why must faith be moment faith? And why should the experience of nothingness ever dominate? The answer to that question is that faith is living in the presence of the Redeemer. And in the moment of utter chaos, of genocide, one does not live in his presence. One must be faithful to the reality of the nothingness. Faith is a moment truth, but there are moments when it's not true. Okay, there's a lot going on here, but I think we can figure it out. On the one hand, Greenberg says, when people argue that the existence of evils like the Holocaust undermine faith in God, they're correct. Faith is living life in the presence of the Redeemer. And after Auschwitz, faith means there are times when faith is overcome. After the Holocaust, there are times when any of us, if we're really being honest with ourselves, have to admit that it doesn't make sense to believe in God. When we think about those who died and suffered in Auschwitz, when we think about children who were murdered, we can't help but feel like there is no God, at least no God who cares about us and acts in history. On the other hand, Greenberg insists, this is not the entirety of human experience. More specifically, he insists, there are moments when faith flickers again. There are moments when even after the Holocaust, we can't help but believe in God. For example, there are moments when people experience unexpected liberation and dignity, when individuals who seemed doomed to die somehow survived. The Jewish people, in fact, seemed doomed to die during the Holocaust, but somehow survived, right? I myself am the grandson of a grandmother who spent more than a year in Auschwitz, found herself on a death march, and lost almost all of her family to the Nazis. And here I am, serving as a Jewish studies professor, teaching a class on Judaism. And almost exactly a month ago, in fact, I celebrated the bar mitzvah of my grandmother's great-grandson, my son. And during moments when you reflect on these seemingly miraculous developments, Greenberg asks, how could you not believe in God? When you look at those moments of redemption that continue to exist in a world full of evil, if you're really being honest with yourself, how could you not believe that there is some sort of God, or at least that there might be some sort of God? For Greenberg, then, what we need to acknowledge is that we live in a world of moment faiths, moments when Redeemer and vision of redemption are present, interspersed with times when the flames and smoke of the burning children who died in the Holocaust blot out our faith. In the world that we inhabit, there's no such thing as unbroken faith, and no such thing as unbroken denial of faith, at least if we're being honest with ourselves. There are going to be moments when we encounter or experience or remember something that feels like redemption, something that feels so wondrous and so miraculous and so like a testimony to the goodness of the world that we can't help but feel like there's a God. But there are also going to be moments when we encounter or experience or remember that something that feels like the flames and smoke of the burning children, something that's so horrific and so evil that we can't help but feel like there is no God. Right? As Greenberg goes on to say, this ends the easy dichotomy of atheist and theist. Faith is a life response to the whole person, to the presence in life and history. Like life, this presence ebbs and flows. If we're really honest with ourselves, Greenberg says, all of us should have moments of atheism, and all of us should have moments of theism. All of us should have moments when, if we're really open to the horrors of the world, we can't bring ourselves to believe in God. And all of us should have moments when, if we're really open to the wonders of the world, we can't help but believe in God. All we have is a life lived betwixt and between these responses. This then is a Jewish response to the second critique we encountered, the claim that belief in an all-caring, powerful God is historically problematic. This is true, Greenberg argues, but it's only part of the story. There are moments when belief in an all-powerful, caring God is historically problematic, but there are also moments when belief in an all-powerful, caring God is historically unavoidable. There are moments when we confront events that undermine belief in God, and there are moments where we confront events that generate belief in God. Belief is not about firmly adopting one view. It's about being open to the complexity and messiness of the world and the ebbs and flows of faith that messiness entails. Okay, so we've seen responses to two sorts of critiques, and in the time we have left, I want to look finally at a response to the third kind of critique. They claim that belief in monotheism is ethically problematic. And the figure we're going to look at here is Marcia Falk, an American Jewish poet, liturgical author, artist, translator, and theologian. She was born in New York in 1946, and like Greenberg, is also still active. She actually just published a new Haggadah several years ago. And the essay I want to consider is one that she wrote in 1989 entitled Toward a Feminist Jewish Reconstruction of Monotheism. As I mentioned, while it was written, of course, before Schwartz's book, takes up some of the issues that Schwartz addresses. So now Falk begins by admitting that there is, in fact, something ethically troubling about how God is often understood. What I want to examine here, Falk says, is a problematic premise that underlines many of our theological images. The theological imagery in Jewish worship is overwhelmingly the image of transcendence. In the theology of the traditional prayer book, God is portrayed, vividly and dramatically, not as part of the world, but as apart from and above it. God is sovereign, the world is God's dominion. God is creator, the world is God's creation. In Judaism, this definition of God as other than the world is so ingrained that it may seem self-evident, tautological. Yet it's also problematic. Because Judaism sees God as perfect and the world as imperfect, the dualism of God and the world is always one of inequality, and ultimately one of hierarchy. Thus, this theological premise supports and even spawns the hierarchical dualism that split the world into two unequal halves. The distinction between God and world sets a pattern that does not allow us to see the distinction between self and other in a positive or even neutral way. Rather, this distinction becomes the basis of hierarchy and domination. Just as we see ourselves as inferior in relation to God, so we view ourselves as superior in relation to others. The theological imagery in Jewish worship, Falk notes, is overwhelmingly the imagery of transcendence, imagery where God is portrayed not as part of the world, but as apart from and above it. Right? Most Jewish sources see God as transcendent, as other than the world, as a being who is categorically different from the cosmos. Moreover, Falk says this divine transcendence is typically understood in hierarchical terms, such that God is perfect and the world is imperfect. God isn't just different from the world, God is somehow higher than or better than the world, free from the world's limits and flaws. And this, Falk insists, is problematic, since the distinction between God and the world sets a pattern. Just as we see ourselves as inferior in relation to God, so we view ourselves as superior in relation to others. Right? Seeing God as different from and better than the world trains us to think in a certain way about difference and hierarchy. It trains us to think that when one thing is different from another thing, that one thing might be better than that other thing. Right? Translated into human relations, this disposes us to understand human difference in similar terms, to think that when two human beings or two human groups are different from one another, one is likely to be better than the other. Jewish views on God often involve a kind of inequality, and this inequality shapes how we view the world and one another. By thinking that God is different from us and better than us, we learn to think that we're different from others and better than others. So Falk agrees that there's something ethically problematic about how we often view God. But she denies that this means that there's something wrong with monotheism itself. This will be our final passage today. Despite all that I have said about Jewish theology, Falk says, I believe that the source of justice and of the passion for justice is to be found in monotheism, in authentic monotheism, not that which is imaged in the standard Hebrew prayer book. For what does monotheism posit? Monotheism posits a single infinite divinity that embraces and extends beyond all that is knowable. What does monotheism mean? What are its true implications? I believe that monotheism means the affirmation of unity in the world. Within the human family, monotheism means that for all of our differences, differences that I celebrate and honor, I am more like you than I am unlike you. It means that a single standard of justice applies to us equally. It means that we, with all creation, participate in a single source and flow of life. The problem, in other words, is not the oneness of divinity, but the otherness of divinity. The problem is our imagery of transcendence, through which we disempower ourselves as we portray God as power over us. According to Falk, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with monotheism. On the contrary, monotheism can be a powerful force for good. Monotheism means the affirmation of unity in the world. It means that for all of our differences, I'm more like you than I am unlike you. It means that a single standard of justice applies to us equally. Right? Monotheism means that we all emerge from the same divine source, and this is ethically significant. It means that all of us, in our uniqueness and our difference, have so much in common and have ethical obligations to one another. It means that we're all part of one family, and we all owe one another justice, dignity, and respect. Instead, Falk says, what's problematic is not the oneness of divinity, but the otherness of divinity. The problem is our imagery of transcendence. There's nothing ethically problematic with believing that there's only one God. What's ethically problematic is believing that one God is utterly different from and better than the world and its human inhabitants, since that belief trains us to think hierarchically, to think that just as God is different from and better than us, so too are we different from and better than others. What we need, in other words, is not a rejection of monotheism, but a rejection of transcendence. We need to think of God as, in some sense, being part of the world around us, as not being different from and superior to us, but as being part of the same reality in which we participate. So this is a Jewish response to the third critique, the claim that monotheism is ethically problematic. Falk agrees that there's something that's problematic, that's troubling, that's ethically flawed about traditional notions of God. What's problematic, though, is not oneness, but transcendence. Monotheism can be a source of human care and concern and justice as long as it's not coupled to transcendence, to a vision of God as different from and superior to us. What we need is a picture of God not as a being out there, but as a being in here, as being part and parcel of the reality we inhabit, and thus as grounding the unity of that reality, even and maybe especially amid its diversity. Okay, there's much more we could be saying about all of these topics. I just want to concern very briefly with sort of the implications of this. I think one of the kind of features of all of the perspectives we've encountered is a sense that there's something at stake in belief in God. Maybe it's intellectual honesty. Maybe it's the possibility of living after the Holocaust. Maybe it's the possibility of ethics itself. I don't know how to resolve any of the questions we've encountered today, but my hope for all of us is that we have space, that we find opportunities, that we create communities where we can wrestle with that question. We can wrestle with the question of just what's at stake in belief in God, and just what matters about the question whether God is dead or whether God is alive. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. We have a couple minutes left. Would love to take a couple of questions. I see there are a few in the chat. I'm not sure if we'll get a chance to get to all of them, but if you want to maybe pick and see if there's one or two that you feel particularly interested in answering. And if anyone else would like to ask a question, please raise your hands, and I'm happy to call on people to unmute as well.
Start with hands, and then at the end I can just offer a quick thought on some of what's in the chat.
Sounds great. Steve, I saw your hand.
Thank you. Oh, one thing, the number of attendees here today is one of the largest we've had for our virtual meetings. And so I think the is God dead question is really preeminent and interesting. My question is God God? Um, when I say that, I mean, is the God of Torah God? I can't believe that, because the way I perceive the God of Torah is something or someone petulant and peevish and unforgiving and above it all. And I just can't believe in a God like that. And sometimes I imagine that the real God will come down to the God of Torah, put his or her hand on the shoulders of God of Torah and say, there, lighten up. Things are going to be okay. And so that's all I have to say about that. And thank you very much for this very stirring presentation.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'll just offer a very brief thought that if you are troubled by the idea of the deity portrayed in the Torah being God, or at least or troubled by the idea that the description of God we find in the Bible is literally true, you find yourself in a long tradition of Jewish thinkers. Most notably, maybe the most influential Jewish thinker of the last 1,000 years, Moses Maimonides, agreed entirely with you. Maimonides thought that one of the single worst forms of idolatry out there was to read the Bible literally. The God of the Bible is imperfect, and to affirm the literal truth of almost any not of almost anything, that's too strong, of many of the claims about God in the Bible, for example, that God has emotions, that God changes, that God can be affected by human beings, for Maimonides, that's blasphemy. And Maimonides, in fact, makes it very clear that from his perspective, the most learned rabbi who believes literally in much of the imagery of the Bible is further away from God than a non-Jewish scientist who's never read the Bible. There's a lot more to say about all of that. There's also a tradition of imagining there being another God out there who kind of puts their hand, to use your image, on the shoulder of the God in the Bible. But I just want to flag that the concern you're raising is one with a long pedigree in the Jewish tradition, although there are also important responses to it as well.
Randy?
I had two thoughts. I'm not sure how significant this is, but in terms of like creating tribalism or differences, or it seems like it almost precedes religion. I mean, like the competition for resources just feels like what sets us up initially against one another. And I don't know then if religion comes in some people's views, it's like a shellac over that original need. I'm not sure about how initially significant religion is in creating the tribalism. And then just really quick, the one other thing I was thinking about was Christianity's gone some ways towards not having transcendence in creating like an incarnated deity. I don't know. And they're still, fighting each other. So
Yeah. So what you're getting at, Randy, I think is both an important potential critique of Schwartz and an important potential critique of Falk. The important potential critique of Schwartz is something along the lines of, is it really the case that beliefs and ideas are the kinds of things that are driving reality, or are beliefs and ideas just sort of the result of material factors, right? Schwartz clearly thinks that our beliefs matter. And, Schwartz is a English professor and a religion professor, and it's probably makes sense to her that beliefs and ideas matter. It makes sense to me. But we could plausibly disagree. We could say, actually, what's going on is that people are tribal. People think terrible things about other people. And it turns out they construct religious beliefs that reflect that, right? Fundamentally, this is a story about material factors driving religious beliefs rather than religious beliefs driving material factors. It's a powerful critique of Schwartz. You're also getting at a powerful critique of Falk. She wants to say that if we kind of overcome this kind of radical transcendence between God and human beings, then that's going to get us out of the pattern of thinking of difference hierarchically. But maybe all it's going to do is to lead us to start to think of ourselves as divine and do all sorts of terrible things when we think of ourselves as divine. And there's a long tradition in Judaism and in Christianity and in many traditions of bad things happening when people start to think of themselves as divine and start to think that there's no gap between them and God, right? Is transcendence a kind of thing that leads us to try to be transcendent over others? Or is transcendence the kind of thing that makes us more humble and recognizes we are not the be all and end all of existence? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think you're getting at an important critique of Falk.
Thank you. I see John's hand up if you have time for one more question, Dr. Sacks. Okay, please. Oh, one sec. You have to, you're still on mute. There we go.
I said I submitted about 7 or 8 questions in the chat, and I'm sure you won't be able to get to any of those. But my question about Moses Maimonides, who said anyone who reads the Torah literally is what, incorrect or something, and yet every Shabbat we read the Torah literally, every single word. And we don't discuss the irrelevance of those words. I think words matter. And if we want to not believe the words of the Torah, then maybe we should change the Torah. Maybe we should rewrite the Torah.
So I think, John, you're getting at a really important both potential critique of Maimonides, but I also think a nuance in Maimonides' thoughts. Maimonides thinks that the Torah is not literally true, but he doesn't think that that means the words of the Torah are not valuable, or even that there's not truth contained in the Torah. Maimonides thinks, in fact, that the Torah was written. This is a whole bigger kind of can of worms, but Maimonides thinks that the Torah was written not by God, but by a human being named Moses, who had 2 characteristics. He had the perfect mind of a philosopher, so he basically knew everything you can know about the world in terms of science and philosophy. But he also had the imagination, a powerful imagination. So he knew how to create concrete, vivid language to express those philosophical truths. Most people, Maimonides thinks, need that kind of concrete, vivid language. So Maimonides thinks that there's actually quite a bit of value in the words of the Torah. It just needs to not be interpreted literally in certain kinds of cases. Right? We need to recognize that when the Bible says that God has a hand or that God has a body, which the Bible says all the time, we need to recognize that the Bible is getting at something else there. So on the one hand, there's a kind of important nuance. Maimonides thinks that the Bible's words matter a great deal. He just thinks that they shouldn't be interpreted literally, but rather metaphorically. But you're also getting at a potential critique of Maimonides, right? In the end, once we start to think that the Bible's words can be reimagined and reinterpreted kind of metaphorically, is there any limit to what we can do? And in the end, are we really engaged in interpretation anymore? Are we simply engaged in our own creative thinking? Right? Is Maimonides someone who is trying to give us a proper interpretation of the Bible that protects us from literalism and idolatry? Or is Maimonides someone who has substituted his particular philosophical notions for an inherited text? Again, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it's a long-standing one in the interpretation of Maimonides and in broader debates about what it means to read the Bible and what it means to try to kind of blend philosophy and science on the one hand with classical religious sources on the other.
I didn't know that Maimonides thought that Moses wrote the entire Torah. I've never heard that before. But if he did believe that, why did Moses write that he would not be able to go into the land of milk and honey because he struck the rock and disobeyed God's commandment not to do that, to get water from the rock? Why did he not know that when he wrote that? And why was he leading the Israelites 40 years in the desert and not read the entire thing that he wrote? It doesn't make any sense to me if that's the claim of Maimonides.
So there's a lot more going on there than we can resolve right now. I'll simply say that for Maimonides, Moses And there are lots of critiques of this as well, but Moses was a gifted teacher. Many of us, when we teach or when we deal with, let's say, children, we write in a way that would be we speak in a way designed to help those people go through a kind of learning process. And from Maimonides' perspective, part of what's going on in the Bible is an attempt by Moses to help both the ancient Israelites and later readers go through a kind of learning process. There's a lot more there, though, that we can discuss, and there are many, many critiques of Maimonides here. In many ways, the theory of biblical authorships with which he's operating here, which he never quite says explicitly, but I think has to be what he thinks, is one that he's borrowing from medieval Islamic philosophy as part of a broader conversation he's having with kind of medieval Islamic thinkers about how to think about the authorship of texts like the Quran and the Bible.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. I know Rabbi Shmuley already mentioned some of the great events we have coming up next week. You can go to our website to learn more about those, or you can always follow us on social media to see more about the humanitarian relief work we're doing in Arizona and Colorado, and the leadership development programs we have for young adults and teens as well. So please follow us there to learn more, and hope to see you all again at one of our upcoming events. Thanks, everyone.